This morning, the Princess of Wales back on the global stage. Kate's first international trip since her cancer recovery, stepping out on her own, a research trip of sorts, learning about a cause she cares deeply about.
Thousands of people have packed the square. People are hanging out the windows, and you can see her right here meeting some of her littlest fans.
The autumn light fell gold across the great hall of Aldenmore Palace, catching on crystal chandeliers and the polished buttons of ceremonial uniforms. It was the 10th anniversary of King Edmund's coronation, and the palace had spent months preparing for a single, flawless afternoon. Every chair was aligned, every guest list vetted twice, every word of the program rehearsed until it sounded less like a script and more like inevitability. The royal family of Aldenmore had built its reputation on control, and today was meant to be the proof of it. Princess Alara arrived early, as she always did, moving through the corridors with the quiet precision of someone who had learned that composure was its own kind of armor. She was the wife of the heir, Prince Rowan, and the title she carried, Princess of the Realm, had once belonged to Rowan's mother, the late Princess Isabel. Isabel's memory lived in the palace the way certain songs live in a house long after the radio has been turned off, present in the walls, impossible to fully silence. Alara had inherited the title, but she had also inherited the responsibility of protecting what it meant. She took her seat beside Rowan in the front row, and for a moment, everything felt as rehearsed as it was supposed to. Then Queen Miriam entered. The queen consort walked with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent a decade learning how to be watched without flinching. She wore deep emerald silk, gloves the color of ivory, and on her head, catching every beam of afternoon light, sat a diamond and sapphire tiara that Alara recognized instantly. Not because she had seen it recently, but because she had seen it in 100 old photographs worn by a woman who was no longer alive to consent to its use. It was Isabel's tiara. Alara's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The room did not go silent, not exactly. The low hum of orchestral strings continued. Guests still murmured pleasantries. But for Alara, everything else fell away except that single, glittering object. It was not decoration. It was memory, worn like a costume, placed on a woman who had spent years trying to distance herself from the shadow it represented. Rowan felt her stillness before he understood its cause. He turned, followed her gaze, and saw the tiara. His jaw tightened. He knew immediately what it meant, because he had grown up watching his mother's memory summoned and dismissed in equal measure by a palace that treated grief as a public resource to be managed rather than honored. King Edmund, several seats ahead, noticed the shift in the room's temperature before he understood its source. He lowered his printed program slowly, and when his eyes found the tiara, his expression did something rare. It hesitated. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply looked, and in that look was the particular guilt of a man who suspects he already knows the answer. Queen Miriam felt the stares gathering like weather. She lifted her chin, held her posture, and waited for Alara to look away first. But Alara did not look away. This was not a disagreement about fashion. It was a question of who had the right to carry Isabel's memory forward, and who had been denied any say in the matter. Alara did not raise her voice. She did something the palace had never quite prepared for. She stood, quietly, and stepped out of the procession line. An aide moved toward her immediately, murmuring something about timing, about the schedule, about how the cameras were already rolling. Rowan raised a single hand, and the aide stopped as if he'd walked into glass. This was not a delay to be managed. It was a rupture, and everyone standing near enough to see Alara's face understood it. To understand why this moment carried such weight, it helps to go back 3 weeks to a smaller, quieter room in Aldenmore's East Wing, where the seeds of this confrontation had already been planted. The wardrobe planning meeting for the coronation anniversary had been, by design, unremarkable, a discussion of guest seating, processional order, and appropriate attire. But when a folder of tiara options was passed around for Queen Miriam's ceremonial look, one entry stopped the room. Isabel's tiara, included among the options with a note describing it as historically significant and available. Alara had objected immediately, not with anger, but with the calm clarity of someone who had thought carefully about this exact possibility. She said that Isabel's belongings should never be used to reinforce another woman's position within the family, especially not during a ceremony built to celebrate the king's reign. It was not, she said, a matter of jewelry. It was a matter of consent, the kind that could no longer be given, and therefore had to be protected by the people who loved her. Rowan had supported her without hesitation. He reminded his father that symbols carried weight long after the moment had passed, that the public did not forget what the family hoped it would. King Edmund had listened. He had nodded, but he had not made a decision, and in the small silence that followed, Queen Miriam had felt something shift beneath her. The sense that no matter how many years she gave to this family, she would always be measured against a woman she had never met. The meeting ended without resolution, and that absence of resolution became its own kind of decision. Days later, a revised wardrobe note quietly returned the tiara to the approved list, describing it now as appropriate to the occasion's historical themes. The language was careful. It was also, in its own bureaucratic way, dishonest, because it buried Alara's objection instead of answering it. King Edmund was informed only that the piece carried historical significance. He was not told that it carried an unresolved conflict. The palace, as it so often did, chose the appearance of harmony over the harder work of honesty. So when Alara saw the tiara on the day of the ceremony, she was not reacting to a surprise. She was reacting to a promise that had been made and then quietly broken. Now, standing at the edge of the procession, she turned to face Queen Miriam directly. The orchestral music softened, as if even the musicians sensed the room's center of gravity had moved. "That tiara," Alara said, her voice even but unmistakably firm, "was never yours to wear without asking." Miriam's composure flickered. "It was approved," she said. "I wore what I was given." "By whom?" Alara asked after I objected. The question did not raise its voice, but it cut through every layer of ceremony the day had been built on. Rowan stepped closer, and when he spoke, his tone carried the weight of something he had waited years to say aloud. "Did you know," he asked Miriam, "that Alara raised concerns about this before it was finalized?" Miriam's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward King Edmund. It was a small gesture, but it told everyone watching exactly how far up the decision had traveled. Edmund felt the room's attention shift toward him, and though no one had accused him directly, the silence made the accusation for them. Alara did not ask for an apology. She asked for something more immediate, that the tiara be removed before the ceremony continued. Edmund's next words would determine whether this remained a private family wound or became a very public reckoning. He had spent decades managing scandal, expectation, and scrutiny, but this crisis was not waiting outside the palace gates. It stood directly in front of him, wearing the faces of the three people he loved most and had, in different ways, failed to fully protect. He looked at each of them in turn. Alara, composed but resolute. Rowan, quiet but immovable. Miriam, waiting for a rescue that did not come. And Edmund understood, with the particular clarity that only crisis provides, that there was no version of continuing the ceremony that did not cost someone something real. He set his folded program down. It was a small gesture, but it changed the atmosphere of the room entirely, because it meant he was no longer hiding behind the printed order of the day. A senior aide approached with the original wardrobe file, and in the margin, in neat handwriting, was Alara's objection, dated and recorded weeks earlier. The palace had known. The palace had chosen to proceed anyway. Edmund's silence, reading that page, became heavier than any argument could have been. Rowan watched his father's expression change and understood, finally, that this had never been a misunderstanding. It had been a choice made by people who believed that if enough time passed, the objection would simply be forgotten. The king ordered the ceremony paused. He asked for a private room for the four of them, away from the cameras, away from the aides who had spent the morning rehearsing smiles. Miriam looked away as she walked. Alara did not. Rowan stayed close to her side, and the four of them disappeared behind a closed door while, outside, whispers began to travel faster than any official statement could contain them. Inside that room, the conversation was quieter than the crisis it was resolving, but no less significant. Miriam sat with her hands clasped, her pride visibly bruised. She had believed that wearing the tiara would signal her acceptance into the family's history, a sign that her place beside Edmund was finally secure beyond question. Instead, it had exposed exactly how insecure that place still felt to everyone around her, including, perhaps, to herself. Alara did not gloat, and she did not soften. She explained plainly what the tiara meant to her and to Rowan, not an ornament, but a boundary that had been crossed without permission. Rowan added what he had been holding back all day, that his mother's memory had never been simply a matter of public sentiment to him. It was personal, unfinished, and not available for palace convenience. Edmund listened to all of it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the ceremonial polish he was known for. He acknowledged that the objection had been recorded and ignored, and that the failure belonged to the systems around him as much as to any one person's choice. He did not defend the decision. He simply admitted that it had been wrong. By the time the ceremony resumed, the tiara was gone. Miriam returned to the procession without it, and though the palace's communications team carefully avoided naming the reason, no explanation was necessary. Enough guests had seen the earlier moment. Enough phones had already captured it. The absence spoke as clearly as the presence had. The revised ceremony moved forward with a quieter arrangement. Rowan and Alara stood closer to the king. Miriam's role in the proceedings was scaled back, not punitively, but undeniably. Royal placement, as anyone familiar with such ceremonies knows, is never accidental. It tells a story of its own, and today's story was one of correction. By the following morning, a leading newspaper ran the two images side by side, Miriam wearing Isabel's tiara before the pause, and Miriam without it afterward. The headline needed no embellishment. It simply asked what everyone was already wondering, what had happened in that room, and why it had mattered enough to stop the ceremony entirely. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates that evening, some carrying flowers, others simply standing in quiet acknowledgement of a memory they felt had finally been protected rather than borrowed. Rowan watched the gathering from a window and said little because there was little left to say. The public did not need an official statement to understand what had happened. They understood, instinctively, that this had never been about a piece of jewelry. It had been about who gets to decide how a person is remembered once they are no longer present to decide for themselves. In the days that followed, Aldenmore's household issued a quiet internal policy that would outlast the headlines. Any object closely tied to Isabel's personal legacy would require direct consultation with Rowan and Alara before its use in future royal occasions. It was not framed as punishment. It was framed, more accurately, as respect, the kind that should have existed from the beginning. Miriam kept her title. Her place beside Edmund remained intact, at least in name. But something had shifted permanently in how the family operated. She had learned, in the most public way possible, that rank alone could not erase the emotional boundaries surrounding a memory she had never been entitled to wear. Edmund, for his part, accepted the new protocol without argument. It was, in its own quiet way, a confession, an admission that the peace he had spent years trying to maintain through silence had never been real peace at all, only the appearance of it. The anniversary ceremony concluded that evening much as it had begun, with music, with formality, with the practice calm the palace had always relied upon. But its meaning had changed entirely. It was no longer remembered as a celebration of a decade of reign. It was remembered as the day a family finally chose truth over the comfort of pretending nothing had happened. Alara emerged from the day not as a woman who had caused a disruption, but as one who had insisted on something the palace badly needed, an honest reckoning with a memory it had spent years managing rather than honoring. Rowan stood beside her, not simply as a husband defending his wife, but as a son who had finally been allowed to defend his mother, too. As the guests departed and the palace doors closed for the evening, the lesson of the day remained, unspoken but unmistakable. Some memories cannot be borrowed, softened, or quietly repurposed for the comfort of the living. They can only be respected, or they will eventually demand to be.